Good evening and welcome to the Campion Lecture at Campion Hall, the Jesuit Hall at the University of Oxford. My name is Brian McCurtha, Jesuit and Fellow in Early Modern History here at Campion Hall. We welcome all those here present and those taking part via YouTube. It is a special pleasure to present our speaker, Dr. Camilla Russell. Since 2015, she has served as publications editor of Institutum Historicum Societatis Iesu at Jesuit Archives, Rome. There, she edits the Society's International Academic Historical Journal with annual bibliography of Jesuit history worldwide, and several book series in Jesuit history, covering monographs and editions of significant sources. Previously, she was lecturer in early modern European history at the University of Newcastle, Australia. She holds a PhD from Royal Holloway College, London, and has been a fellow of the Harvard Center for Italian Renaissance Studies at Villa I Tatti, Florence. Her research focuses on various themes: the cultural and religious history of Renaissance Italy, the early modern world, Jesuit history, and women's history. Her first monograph was entitled Giulia Gonzaga and the Religious Controversies of 16th Century Italy, published by Brepols in 2006. In the field of Jesuit history in the 16th and 17th centuries, she has contributed significantly to the study of the Indipidi, that vast body of letters by young men to their Father General, requesting to go to the Society's missions outside Europe. The typical individual life cycle of the Jesuit in the century 1540 to 1640 is the theme of her latest book, Being a Jesuit in Renaissance Italy, Biographical Writing in the Early Global Age, published by Harvard University Press in 2022. Her work on the Society's history is characterized by deep immersion in the archival materials and a keen appreciation of the various genres involved. While maintaining academic rigor, her writing displays a sensitivity to the spiritual horizon within which these men articulated their lives and their hopes. This evening, Dr. Russell will explore the early modern Jesuit missionary experience in Asia, drawing on their correspondence with Rome. This particular lens offers insights on the Society's adaptation to host cultures and on those cultures themselves, an encounter leading to influences in multiple directions.
Well, now I've got my own microphone. Good. Well, my thanks to Master of Campion Hall, Father Nicholas Austin, for inviting me and chairing the discussion afterwards, so you will meet him afterwards. And for the very kind introduction, I thank fellow in early modern history, Father Brian McCurtha, my esteemed former colleague as academic director at the Roman Jesuit Archive, ARSI. And before I begin, if I may, I wish to dedicate this lecture to two scholars who happen to share a significant birthday year in 2024, with a combined total of 180 years. Professor Barry Collett, present this evening, and my honours and master's supervisor at the University of Melbourne in Australia. Thank you for being here, Barry. Your brilliant scholarship formed right here in Oxford, and inspiration all those years ago helped bring me to this lecture tonight. The second dedicatee is Professor Emerita Alison Brown of Royal Holloway, University of London, in recognition of her distinguished contribution to the field of Italian Renaissance history, her outstanding supervision of my doctoral studies in London, and her firm, ever-growing friendship over the years are very special to me. And while her venerable age prevented her from making the journey this evening from London, she is present online. So thank you, Alison. Thank you also to the community here at Campion Hall for your very warm welcome and hospitality. And so friends and colleagues, all, both here and online, thank you for your presence. And now to the lecture. Jesuits in the early modern period performed much of their missionary work under the patronage of the Portuguese and Spanish crowns, thereby operating within the sphere of European overseas empires. However, several Jesuit missions were located in territories outside European jurisdiction. While depending on Crown patronage for vital lifelines such as funding costs and providing means of travel, in such cases, Jesuits lived and worked as guests of local rulers and their populations. Working in these contexts, the approach regularly used by Jesuits, known as accommodatio, or the practice of adaptation to local cultural forms and social practices, underpinned by the aim of converting populations to the Catholic faith, generated a large body of sources that provide information about the Jesuit experience, as well as numerous accounts about their host societies and the interactions that took place with them. In this lecture, I will enlist the correspondence sent back to Rome by mainly Italian Jesuit missionaries from these territories, focusing on Asia. My sources are almost all in the form of letters, mainly to the Jesuit head, the Superior General in Rome, written for operational and organisational purposes, avoiding thereby the embellishments on the whole of literary treatments and publicity-oriented, idealised accounts. Here, I do not look at theoretical treatments of the subject in the sources, also better known. Using the correspondence, I will present a series of case studies to explore examples of Jesuit accommodatio, to uncover some features of early modern, multi-directional interactions and what I might say entanglements, and draw some conclusions from them. It is useful to note too that I am researching and speaking as a trained scholar of European history. And as a Europeanist, I propose this subject as a promising line of inquiry with, I think, a possible basis for collaboration with specialists in the regions touched on in this paper. Jesuit accommodatio, the core of this lecture, presents an array of interpretive challenges and historiographical uncertainties. Ines Zupanov, Nicholas Standart, Marcus Friedrich, Stefania Tutino and Helene Vuitton are just some in Jesuit historical studies who in recent years have engaged with and critiqued the method and its place in contemporary scholarship of Jesuit global and mission studies. They have identified the many pitfalls and even potential anachronisms in using Jesuit accommodatio, especially problematic in efforts to explore non-European contexts, given the Jesuit European frame of reference for its practice and extant written records on the whole. At the same time, these critiques have helped provide much needed nuance. For example, Vuitton identifies accommodatio in the early modern Asian context less as a formal method than as a haphazard series of, quote, fragile, tentative, and often embattled experiments. The practice created what Zupanov, borrowing from Homi K. Bahaba, has called a third space relating to the context in India, and what Standart has termed spaces of encounter in China. Drawing on these studies, my lecture seeks to demonstrate that in the early modern period, the specific features of Jesuit accommodatio generated such a high degree of contact, information, and mutual influence, despite its representational limitations. It nevertheless provides some useful documentary access points to territories beyond Europe where Europeans operated but did not rule. The sources used in this lecture, I argue, bear this point out. I aim to show that while Jesuit accommodatio ultimately did not prevail in the early modern context, several of its more prominent features were challenged and then disallowed by the Catholic hierarchy in Rome, encapsulated by and known as the rights controversies. And the method did not produce the large-scale conversions that occurred in lands subject to European rule. But I argue it warrants our attention for different reasons. It activated a series of dynamics whereby Jesuits were actively being shaped by their environment, and in order for that to happen, local populations were accommodating them. This was an unusual dynamic, to say the least, in the early history of European recorded experiences in non-European lands. How this worked in practice, from its foundations to the textual traces that it left behind, is the subject of the main body of this lecture. But first, a brief note on terminology. I have retained the Latin accommodatio, flagging thereby the theological underpinnings and Christian conversionary motivation for its practice, thereby avoiding collapsing its meaning into the English word accommodation, since one of my arguments here is that this is what their interlocutors, the Jesuit interlocutors, their local hosts, were doing on their home territory, while the Jesuits, through their missionary method, were adapting in practice their message and mores to their audiences. The main part of this lecture will be conducted in 4 parts. After introducing the foundations of Jesuit accommodatio in the early modern context, I will proceed to brief case studies according to region: South India, Japan, Macau and China, grouped together, and finally the Indonesian archipelago. So, to the body of the lecture now. As noted, Jesuit accommodatio is a practice of adapting Christian conversionary aims, terminologies and messages to local cultural forms and social practices for the purpose of bringing about conversion to the Catholic faith. As Stefania Tutino paraphrased, accommodatio meant adapting the true to the real. That is, Jesuits adapted the true, and for missionaries, that is Christianity, to the cultural and social realities in which they found themselves. However, accommodatio was not just a Jesuit method or practice. Its origins lie deep in Judeo-Christian traditions that use the idea of God's divine accommodation to human realities as the basis for adapting universal principles to particular circumstances. It was prescribed by St. Paul and thereafter practiced as one key approach to missionary work. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win over Jews. To those outside the law, I became like one outside the law. The Pauline call to adaptation finds many echoes in Ignatian thought and writing, and crucially, not just in relation to missionary contexts. For example, the theme of accommodatio has a pronounced presence in the spiritual exercises, which were to be adapted to the disposition of the persons who desire to make them, that is, to their age, education and ability. The idea was that the retreat was an exchange, not a lesson. It was dialogic as well as optimistic, quote, in order that both the giver and receiver of the spiritual exercises may be of greater help and benefit to each other. It should be presupposed, the exercises goes on, that every good Christian ought to be more eager to put a good interpretation on a neighbour's statement than to condemn it. More generally, in the exercises, the entire world, including the whole human race, was set in an optimistic frame that lay the ground for this attitude. Quote, I will consider how God dwells in creatures, in the elements, giving them existence, in the plants, giving them life, in the animals, giving them sensation, and here crucially, in human beings, giving them intelligence, and finally, how in this way he also dwells in myself. Some foundations were set here, I think, for Jesuit encounters with the wider world, while the practice of adaptation to one's environment was encoded in the constitutions. For example, in identifying the importance of learning languages for the work of conversion and tasked with preparing youth and Jesuits for life in the world. In addition to the usual theology, Latin, Greek and Hebrew, the universities of the Society of Jesus, the Constitution stated, stipulated that there may be teachers of Chaldaic, Arabic and Indian, where these are necessary or useful, with attention given to the diversities of place and reasons which may move us to teach them. Immediate environments and circumstances were to determine many norms of Jesuit formation, learning and life, and not the other way around. For example, in terms of dress, famously, the Constitution stipulated that Jesuits were to choose clothing that suited the local norms and circumstances of those in the local area, in an equivalent state of life to them. This later evolved into Jesuits famously dressing as Brahmins in India and as Confucian scholars in China. While these were the foundations for Jesuit accommodatio, they were not exclusive to the missions, but encompassed all manner of Jesuit works among themselves, in their spiritual life, and in their ministries. At the same time, accommodatio was not the only method enlisted by Jesuits in missions or elsewhere. The Society of Jesus often participated in enforcing Catholicism, in some of its works in Goa, with the Inquisition there, for example, in Northern and Eastern Europe's counter-reformations, and I use that in a technical sense, against the spread of the Protestant Reformation, and in its role in some aspects of the Galileo affair, just to name a few. Indeed, often Jesuits operated on opposite sides of a methodological divide, in disagreement with each other, with their collective spiritual and operational eye trained on bringing about what they call the greater glory of God. Sometimes they chose to adapt to their environment and interlocutors, and sometimes they did not, depending on their judgment of the circumstances and the people involved. Accommodatio, then, must be observed, I think, in its specific time and place, and not as a universally practiced method in the Society of Jesus, but it was well suited to contexts outside Europe's imperial territories, where Jesuits were minorities, dependent on the hospitality of their hosts, often in changeable and precarious environments, and where power dynamics did not play in their favour. Accommodatio offered ideal features for building a Jesuit mission method in these places, grounded in the reality of actual circumstances, as well as founded in solid scriptural and Ignatian thought. Accommodatio became such a potent tool for the Society of Jesus that it also became one of its hallmarks. Without scriptural and Ignatian spiritual underpinnings, I argue, it would not have had the take-up and durability that it had. If it had been predominantly understood in scriptural, theological and spiritual terms, it likely would not have been applied in any specific way. It's this mix of characteristics that makes it potent. And used. As I will show in the rest of this lecture, in many parts of the Portuguese sphere, Jesuit work in the Indies, a term and place understood as much spiritually as geographically, paved the way for creating spaces where Jesuits and their non-European interlocutors come into view together in the Jesuit textual records. Many early modern sources, by contrast, were committed to the task of enforcing and constructing separation between groups. Accommodatio, then, by its nature, was committed to interactions, meeting points and exchanges. And it is on this basis that we will explore the Jesuit correspondence from Asia to find out more about what Jesuit sources can tell us about these exchanges. From the 1580s, it was among the Christian communities that a key chapter in Jesuit cultural adaptation unfolded. Among members of the ancient Syro-Malabar Church, sometimes called Thomas Christians. A key figure here was the Catalan Jesuit Francisco Ros, studied by Anthony Mercury, SJ, on whose book I worked as IHSI editor, and to whose research I am grateful for some of my quotes and comments here. According to Mercury, Ros came to the pioneering view that, as I quote Mercury, social structures and customs in a mission context as facilitating agents were seen as facilitating agents and not obstacles in the way of mission. And that the innovations developed by Ros among the Malabar Christians were crucial, what he calls testing grounds for Jesuit accommodatio. The practice's application in India also set a pattern for resistance to it that was ever present in its history. For his part, Ros defended his mission approach against fellow Catholic missionaries, whom he called Romanizers, interestingly, arguing, quote, this is Ros, arguing, it is impossible, here's your quote, it is impossible to force the Thomas Christians to do the things that they are not ready for. Instead, Ros, while remaining uncompromising on what he saw as the theological errors of his Christian interlocutors, gradually developed a system of engagement with the local Christians through trial and error, whereby he adapted Catholic worship in many but the essentials to local forms and practices, seeking to distinguish form from essence and opening the path to adaptation in the former and insisting on adherence to Rome in the latter. These features of the third space identified by Zupanov, where Jesuits distinguished politics from religion and Christianity from being European, included plural voices preserved among the Jesuit ones. For example, in Malabar, Mar Abraham, the last East Syrian bishop of the Thomas Christians who had entered into communion with the Catholic Church, wrote directly, in his own words, to Jesuit Superior General Claudio Acquaviva in 1594 that, quote, with the help of the fathers, this church is being greatly assisted, most of all by Father Ros, who, with his proficiency in the Syriac languages, helped me to translate some passages from Latin and to correct some books. We owe also to the labour of these fathers the reform of some of the customs. Now, local perspectives, unsurprisingly, were not always so accommodating as Mar Abraham's were. Towards the end of the 18th century, the Archbishop of Craigenor, Mar Joseph Kiriatou, wrote that the appointment of the European Ros as Archbishop 2 centuries prior was popularly perceived by many, quote, as a malicious and violent usurpation of the Latin Catholic Church against the ancient hierarchy of the Thomas Christian Church. Dynamics over time, then, were multi-directional. In the frame were groups and individuals whose voices can be heard on all sides, sometimes giving ground and sometimes not. Another important example of Jesuit accommodatio, once more from India, this time among non-Christians. In the first decade of the 17th century, Roberto de Nobili drew from Ros's model of working among the Thomas Christians and applied similar approaches among the high castes of the Madurai region from 1606. It fell to and he extended it further, really. It fell to de Nobili's mentor, Francisco Ros, by then Archbishop of Angamali Craigenor, under whose jurisdiction de Nobili worked. And Ros had to explain and defend the approach in a letter to Jesuit Superior General Claudio Acquaviva, and quote, now it has pleased God our Lord to make use of Father de Nobili, so that by adopting the dress of the country, by learning their different languages, by conforming to their way of eating and to many of their customs, by conforming, which entail no offence to God, he might win the esteem and affection of the people, and that the proud Badajes, military elites in Madurai, and self-conceited Brahmins who look down on everybody, might be brought under the yoke of our Lord Jesus Christ crucified. Cultural adaptation, as is evident here, was practiced without necessarily being accompanied by esteem for the other, as far as at least we can see from Father Ros's account here. Tellingly, in the Malabar mission context, according to Mercury, the term accomodarse was used for the first time in 1580, not to describe Jesuit mission practice, but as a criticism of the Thomas Christians for not adapting their form of Christianity to that of the Latin Catholic Church. And according to Zupanov further, it was the Malabar rites controversies that engulfed the mission in the 18th century, which marked the starting point for the term accommodatio to identify the Jesuit mission approach there. In both cases, the history of the term's use chimes with the argument of my lecture that the historical value of Jesuit accommodatio is the multiple historical agents that come into view, not the success or otherwise of the method, because while the Thomas Christians are being criticised here by Ros, their agency emerges, which is of interest here, for their lack of accommodation to Jesuit wishes. In the case of the Malabar rites, the Jesuits were criticised by Romanisers for accommodating too much to local circumstances. Both cases show that accommodatio, in order for it to work, depended on each group becoming familiar with one another through a dynamic that included adaptation and accommodation, both on the Jesuit side and on the side of his interlocutor, leading on either or both sides sometimes to acceptance and other times to rejection, and very often a mixture. The dialogic feature of accommodatio is why it is valuable, I think, for scholars of European and possibly non-European worlds, despite the obvious limitations conditioned by the mainly Jesuit authorial voice, and necessarily incomplete on its own. But the importance and later influence of Jesuit accommodatio in India, briefly touched on here, can be observed in the wider Asian missionary context, and were closely observed in person by the Jesuit visitor to the East Indies, Alessandro Valignano, and Matteo Ricci, before developing their own versions of, and famous versions, of the practice in Japan and China respectively, to which regions we turn our attention now. In Japan, the accounts that Jesuits relayed back to Rome about the many converts to Christianity during the so-called Christian century, from the mid-16th century before persecution ended the official presence of Christianity by the mid-17th century, provide evidence of the spaces afforded by accommodatio. These spaces could be suddenly expanded in Japan through multiple conversions and mass conversions, and then contracted, often by family pressures and local political circumstances. For example, the Jesuit Organtino Soldo, I call him an accommodatio radical. He really was. He writes as if he was operating in 1960s missions. He wrote in 1595 about how utterly dependent the Jesuit operations were on the Japanese and their responses to the Christian message. Quote, "The great disposition that already everyone in these kingdoms of Japan had towards converting to their creator in the space of a few years is because, on the one hand, our adversary, the devil, was dissimulating with us, leaving us to preach the gospel without any impediment, and on the other hand, diminishing the strength of the bonzi." So these are political considerations. "Who, convinced of the truth that we were preaching, not only did not contradict us, but also they said positive things about us. Some of the most important and learned leaders getting baptised, so that the road to conversion was greatly facilitated. That more clearly than ever is evident this year the divine providence in making once again more than 900 converts to Christianity, almost all of them nobles, among which there were some leading figures of these kingdoms of this Japan." Here he's not so radical, but he is reporting the situation with a view to Rome apprehending this information. Of course, there were many limits to the spread of Christianity, as Soldo wrote. One Japanese gentleman, I haven't included all of the quotes, so bear with me while you hear these quotes. One Japanese gentleman who heard our preaching, quote, "is not yet baptised. He tells us that he wished that all of his servants and vassals would become Christians, profusely praising our law. And it has been many years that he was to become Christian, but his father stopped him. I hope, however, that God will guide him into a good port. unquote. Others were such ideal converts that they moulded themselves almost seamlessly into the form of Christians and into the works of the Society of Jesus. In the same letter, Nyakisoldo observed, quote, 2 brothers, recently converted, and one with all of his gentlemen, he comes to the Jesuit house often and practices his Christian religion with us with such familiarity as if he were a member of the society. Much of the work of these hybrid settings depended on what I call hinge figures. Again, Nyakisoldo wrote, if your paternity could see the converso, the convert, that is here in this house, and the occupations that these brothers continuously have in practicing serious compassion towards us, because these ordinarily work until midnight, and they never rest, being always occupied, sometimes with the Gentiles and sometimes with the Christians, unquote. Textual records connected to accommodatio, along with revealing agency and power on the part of host societies, also for the same reasons show evidence of resistance on the part of Jesuit interlocutors and converts to Christianity. In one of the many soli written privately to the Superior General, only the soli mean letters that only the Superior General could read and only he could reply to them. In 1596, Francesco Pasio wrote from Nagasaki about the Japanese brothers whom the most senior Jesuit, the Indies visitor Alessandro Valignano, was planning to make priests through seminary training in Macau, the base for the Japan mission in times of persecution and ultimately expulsion from Japan. So from Macau, Pasio explained, or about Macau, Pasio explained that he and many others were against the seminary, because sending them to seminary, because the Japanese were seen as, quote, being people of such fragile and unsound faith, as well as naturally proud, they are little subject to the fathers in whose company they are staying, little zealous in matters of the soul, and they are so difficult to govern. The experience that one notices is that many Japanese that have been in Macau for some years are so attached to their own ways, unquote. Framed in negative terms, these Japanese Catholic brothers were actually likely also resisting pressures to Europeanize. For Pasio, a delicate balance of differences could easily be put out of balance. Quote, we are afraid that as priests, the Japanese, wanting to be the same as the Europeans, they would apply themselves badly to doing the tasks that they are now doing, which would lead to a greater loss to Christianity, unquote. Interestingly, Pasio claimed also to be afraid of the Japanese feeling inferior to joining Europeans for priestly training, something he did not want. Quote, if the Japanese see themselves as inferior to our Europeans in understanding and speaking and writing, they will be burdened with melancholy, giving them much travail, unquote. The Jesuit objective then was not for a synchronized Japanese-European Catholicism, but to have the Japanese change nature and custom, as one letter says. This, according to Pasio, was the principal objective that Father Valignano expects and thinks, that is, their training in Macau, will consent to take place. And indeed was the aim of accommodatio in this period, and of its chief architect, Alessandro Valignano. That is, it was a temporary meeting place on the way to changing one's very nature through conversion. But it actually didn't work out the way Jesuits wanted it to. The Japanese appear in these sources as resistant to European ways, in some of the sources, and through their resistance effectively displaying a more Asian Christianity, viewed by the Jesuits as disobedience in parts. This was the language of empire in some ways used by the Jesuits, but the reality was different. Moving just the right pace, to China. Impressing and convincing the elite of the merits of Christianity was one of the Jesuits' priorities, and accommodatio was the most effective tool to this end. On several occasions in Michele Ruggeri's long letter from Macau dated 1583, the year he finally entered China together with Matteo Ricci, the first Jesuits to do so, Ruggeri mentions one of the most important tools of accommodatio, learning the language of the Chinese to explain our concepts and way of proceeding. About his Chinese hosts, he wrote, "It is important for these lords of China, given that they are of great ability and art in government, that we Jesuits are erudite and that we know how to do other things of ability." The Chinese naturally had the upper hand. As fellow Jesuit Francesco Pasio explained from Macau in his letter to Claudio Acquaviva on the 25th of December, auspicious date of course, 1582, quote, "Ordinarily the Chinese lie and make no moves unless it is for their own interests." The Jesuits' presence in Portuguese Macau was equally dependent on the Chinese. Pasio wrote, again in 1596, over a decade after he first wrote in 1582, he wrote, "Macau is a small city without any territory, and it can be unmade every time that China wants it." The very practice of accommodatio, which allowed the Jesuits into China and to operate there, and in Portuguese Macau, also provided a window onto China's awesome power. The Maluku or Malacca Islands, sometimes known as the Spice Islands in the Indonesian archipelago, where just a handful of Jesuits operated at the end of the 16th century, provided a very different setting from South India, Japan, Macau and China in terms of adaptation and the limits and opportunities brought by local accommodation and its absence, depending on the political winds which blew in very different directions in these islands, with intra-island conflicts as well as shifting allegiances, sometimes with each other, other times with the Portuguese, who had operated in the region, bringing Christianity with them from their stronghold Malacca since 1511, occasionally with the Spanish in the relatively nearby Philippines, accompanied sometimes by conversions to Christianity and other times with rulers who chose to align with the Muslim sphere and became Muslims and were Muslims within the Muslim sphere of trade and politics, also converting to Islam intermittently since the 14th century, and then on occasion back again to Christianity, with large swathes of the population retaining traditional animist beliefs and rituals as well. The dominant themes for Italian Jesuits writing from this very complex region were isolation and desperation for Portuguese and Spanish military protection, in the case of the latter from the nearby Philippines, relatively nearby Philippines, since the Jesuits regularly felt their lives to be in danger, as well as Christianity there. The Jesuits' vulnerability, loneliness, and relatively poor local standing, in some respects, are palpable in their letters. Local viewpoints seep through the misery. For example, in one letter when a Jesuit complains that lack of Jesuit reinforcements, where lack of Jesuit reinforcements in the mission and lack of a regular turnover of mission personnel serving the local populace meant that, quote, "the people interpret it badly, that is, the general atmosphere of neglect. Their reputation suffered." Yet here too, adaptation and accommodation are clear themes in the Jesuit letters. Once again, learning the language was identified as the essential ingredient in their works, as we see from this letter from Mission Superior Bernardo Ferrari to Superior General Mercurian, written in Tidor on 21st of March 1582, of his confrere, Father Pero Mascarenhas. He wrote of his, quote, "desire to help these Christians, to which effect he learnt the Malay and Ternate languages, and he preached in both languages. From language comes knowledge, which is conveyed back to Europe in these letters, following a method resembling the art of diplomacy, sharing what information comes to hand, such as in one letter about one island, quote, "The island is very fertile. There are beasts that resemble pork, but they're white. The meat is very good. The island has a mountain completely covered in ginger that the earth naturally produces here." As for local voices, much of these are presented in terms of the politicisation of religion and resistance to complete conversion, except for expedient motives, revealing the dynamics of local agency and political survival mechanisms in the region. So to quote here a letter from the mission, "The king of Bacciano, despite being aligned with the king of Ternate, nevertheless did not abandon the Muslim sect on account of not having been armed by the Portuguese. And he fears that if he were to return to being Christian, that his people, as much as his subjects as his friends, may abandon him. But in being armed well, then he will discover himself to be Christian and will then castigate his subjects for not wanting to follow him." The politicisation of religion is mingled with local agency. Rulers here decided what to do based on the prevailing situation, such as refusing to interact with the Europeans, including Jesuits, if they were thought to be politically or militarily hostile. The king of Salib sent his servant to convey to me, here's a quote, that he was preparing himself to come and visit the fathers. This is Bernardo Ferrari writing. But in order not to leave his island alone, and not knowing if the Castilians were our friends or not, for this reason he did not come. He didn't come to visit. The chiefs of Siao, closer to the Philippines than Celebes or Sulawesi, did seek protection from Spain, as we see in this document from the Siao chiefs addressed to the Spanish governor of the Philippines in 1593, and which the Jesuits had translated from the Singarese language into Spanish for presentation at the Manila court on the chiefs' behalf, since the threats the chiefs reported from nearby Ternate Island prevented them from going there themselves. Quote, "Because it's necessary to guard this island and defend it from the Terrenates, lest they disturb us." This is the chief's perspective, and it's their words. "As those who have now come from there affirm that they will do so without fail, and many will come this time. For these reasons we are forced to remain here, and supposing that we cannot go, we say that whatever our king will do there, together with Father Antonio Marta, superior of the religious of the Society of Jesus of Molucco, with Father Antonio Pereira, his companion, that whatever the three of them do, they will promise and request in our name to the Lord Governor." Here, the Jesuits were not so much shaping local life as being shaped by it, responding to requests to enter into the negotiations for political survival and military protection from Spain on behalf of populations in the region. For the chiefs, significantly, these Jesuits were not from Europe, although they could obviously interact with the Europeans who they were going to visit, but they were religious of the Society of Jesus of Maluco, and their role extended to diplomacy on the chiefs and not Portugal's or Spain's behalf. So to circle back to the beginning of the main topic of this lecture, I would like to suggest that the ancient genealogy of Accommodatio, its Ignatian foundations in the Society of Jesus, and formative conditions for its development in Jesuit works, especially in Asia, afforded people significant spaces for first-time meetings and then prolonged contact between groups, and importantly, for the purposes of this lecture, produced textual and other materials about these meetings. And myriad voices do emerge from this process. They were filtered through the Jesuit gaze and put in to Jesuit words, not always though, sometimes in their own words, which both enabled and inhibited voices to be heard, Most of the non-European voices here are pro-Jesuit and pro-Christianity, understandably conserved by them in their archive. But there is plenty of pushback and resistance as well, and it comes through these documents. Indeed, in its applied form, we may observe how Jesuits in non-European settings in the early modern world enlisted accommodatio, and in so doing adapted themselves and their messages, while their host societies were the ones doing the accommodating or deciding not to. So despite the imbalances, or perhaps because of them on all sides, depending on the context, the asymmetrical relationships, it might be possible to view accommodatio not only as a Jesuit method, but also in its applied form as encompassing a shared practice that travelled multidirectionally and depended on interactions to work. Jesuit accommodatio in lands outside European imperial rule was as much about being accommodated, perhaps even more so, than it was about accommodating. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Camilla. We are now handing over to Father Nick Austin, Master of Campion Hall, who will chair the questions.
So thank you, Brian, and a special thank you to Professor Russell for a very engaging, stimulating talk. So please do indicate here in the room if you would like to ask a question. We will also be keeping an eye on YouTube if any viewers wish to paste a question there as well.
Can you hear me? Sorry. Thank you so much for a great presentation. My name is Matthew. I find it interesting that you presented Francesco Rose as, correct me if I'm wrong, but as an example of accommodatio, just because I was reading and I found that he was the first bishop after the Synod of Diamper in Malabar. And so in my mind, he would be an example of that effort to Latinize, right? And so I was just wondering if you could speak to that. And it kind of reminded me of Alexander Hen's argument. I don't know if you know Alexander Hen. He writes about Hindu-Christian encounters in Goa. And he makes this argument that the Krista Purana, which is an accommodated text, was written at the same time that the Portuguese were destroying books in Goa. But that these were not separate processes, but they were actually connected, right? It was actually meant to replace the Hindu scriptures. So, yeah, I was just wondering if you could speak to that. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Is my mic? Yep, that's how you can hear me okay? Yep. Thank you very much. Yes, the key to my argument here, and you are absolutely correct, Ros engaged in a number of different activities, and some of them were very repressive. And as he moved along in his experience in the mission fields, he became more and more convinced that those methods that he did adopt at the beginning that were repressive were ineffective and would not bring any success at all to the mission. He is more well known for those measures that worked against the traditional religious forms of the Christians among whom he was working. And so thank you for giving me the opportunity to mark that as well, that's what he's most known for. This new research by Anthony Mercury goes further I think, than scholars have into the documentation that shows his change of mind on the method that he thinks is the right one for getting what he wants, which is to bring the Thomas Christians into unity with the Catholic Church. That objective doesn't change, but the methods that he wishes to employ do. And they include working linguistically and liturgically very closely with those Christians to the ends, to achieve what he set out to do. So this is an example of trying to make a distinction between the conversionary objectives of accommodatio and the methods that were used to do that. And in this particular context, testing grounds, it's a testing place. So I'm not arguing that it was where accommodation was practiced in a full sense or in the sense that it was used later by other Jesuits and rightly described as accommodation to local forms and practices, but that it was a testing ground. And there I am quoting Anthony Matchery. I hope that helps nuance it a bit, but I thank you for your question because it's needed.
Thank you very much. Over here.
For the lecture. I guess I had a question to something you said in the very beginning about the sources and looking at this correspondence. I guess I'm wondering if it's possible to speak a bit more about kind of using some of the letters that were not perhaps intended for publication versus I'm thinking about the Jesuit letters that are intended for publication that end up being published in things like the Lettres de Fiande or in France or the relations with the Americas. I guess I'm curious about, I mean, I don't know, were those letters written with the intention of publication versus some of these not written with that intention? How much would that factor into the kind of the person writing the letter versus then how it ends up being revised and then published in Europe once it's received by the superiors?
Yes, thank you. There is quite a difference between the letters that I have explored here that were for the purposes of governance, administration, working out policy, working out the difficult questions of mission, and the letters that were sent back for the purposes of publication. So the famous annual letters, so-called annual letters that were sent back and then very quickly gained a great deal of popularity among European audiences on narrative accounts of the missions, and they tended to strike a different note. These kinds of knotty questions, discussions about Romanizers and discussions about conflicts and internal questions about methods do not tend to appear in those annual letters that were published. And they tend to be about themes that might be a little bit more familiar to us about Jesuit history in Asia that really describe some of the more celebratory aspects and successes, the numbers of conversions, the numbers of colleges founded, the numbers of buildings that were being built, the political and other successes. Often the language, I would say, the language of empire, I think, runs through most of these letters, many of these letters, possibly more so in these letters that were intended for publication, because they were also intended to appeal to European, also benefactors, to the crown that was supporting the missions. And so they had a closer tie-in, I think, with the imperial objectives. And here we have kind of knotting out that missionary method and really kind of debating it amongst themselves in ways where I feel that local perspective just comes through a little bit more that might be of value for us. So I hope I've made that distinction. It's not to say that the annual letters aren't absolutely fascinating for a lot of information that comes through, a lot of it factual, and it's not to say that these are not full of rhetorical constructions that are clearly trying to guide the reader to respond and support in different ways. So, I mean, by no means taking these letters at face value, or literally, as much as seeing them as a mechanism to get to some of those questions that they themselves were trying to kind of grapple with. Thanks.
Thank you. I was rather surprised to find that your research had taken you as far south as the Maracaibo Islands. Now, I really have two questions, but I'm not going to ask the second. So I'll ask this one about the geography of the correspondence. Have you any signs of missionary work, or indeed trading or naval or other activities further south? You can see what I'm getting at for Australian history.
Yes. Thank you to Barry Collett, who is one of the dedicatees of this lecture and my supervisor from Melbourne University. I actually embarked on this research project, this strand, this series of questions about Asia as it appears in the European and Jesuit sources that I was beginning to become familiar with. I started on that path from my place in Australia at Newcastle University as lecturer there, because I wanted to try to bring my research to my region. And this was the furthest I could get. So I will leave it as an open question. There's nothing that I have found to say that there was a knowing encounter with the Australian mainland or associated islands. And so we will have to leave that question as an open one, and we will have to say no for now. But we can observe the extreme isolation in which I think these Jesuits really found themselves in lands that have very interesting, rich and complex histories right around this time.
We have some questions here.
Hi, I'm Vijay, a Jesuit from India. Thank you for this wonderful lecture. I have a Goan ancestry, so I have been a victim, my ancestors rather, were victims and beneficiaries, both of the two strands that you spoke about. On the one hand, this colonizing, mechanisms like Inquisition and stuff like that. At the same time, contributing immensely to our language, Konkani. My question is this. When Jesuits started out their mission with the primary intention of conversions, they also were fascinated by the beauty of the cultures and languages that they encountered all over the world. Somehow, especially during these days of post-colonial discourse, that somehow that aspect gets hidden. Any conversion to Christianity is seen as a colonial project, but Jesuits are one body, I think, who in many parts of the world stood against the colonizing, the project and its larger political underpinnings. So, do you find often Jesuits dwelling on these aspects of cultures, the beauty and their fascination with the languages and cultures of people.
Could you just repeat the last part of that question? I'm so sorry. Yep.
Do we find frequently Jesuits writing to Rome about the cultures that they encounter, not within the conversion context,
Yep.
but pursuing this knowledge for its own sake, for appreciating the beauty of these cultures, rather than deriding them as paganistic and superstitious, cultural elements?
Yes, and in fact, it's such a delicate balance to be working with these sources, because on the one hand, it wasn't quite possible to include the sort of the complexities and often contradictions around the figure of Ros, and on the same token, Ros himself, but also Roberto de Nobili, and as I said, Organtino Gnecchi-Soldo, they write with lyrical appreciation that I do take seriously and literally, in parts, about the esteem, about the genuine appreciation and travelling so deeply into the local experience that these Jesuits do want to share that experience as a profound one that is based on mutual respect. These are human stories. And really one of my arguments about Jesuit accommodatio is that Jesuits find themselves through this method standing face to face and needing, as with their method really guiding them, to enter deeply into that local world. And they do it. They do it. And I think that human part of the story it tells us also probably why these exchanges really did happen. They're not just recorded, they really did happen, and they did carry dynamic exchanges along with them in quite along, quite a number of different paths. So your question and the first question are helping me try to say this is quite difficult to balance the kind of human experiences that are recorded in these letters. And we have, what I did say, the language of empire running through, and a lack of respect running through. And we also have what I've just described to you in response to your question. So thank you.
Thank you. Father Patrick at the front.
Thank you very much, Camilla. And I think it's related to what you just said, but on another perspective, is how the process of accommodatio has brought a lot of knowledge, and you emphasized the role of the linguistic approach by the Jesuits, and how from this linguistic approach they really built new knowledges, not only in terms of extending them, but even in terms of developing new disciplines, new fields, like, even if it's challenged, but what you just said before, like anthropology and taking just records of habits, etc. So how would you, where would you put the role of knowledge they were learning, Jesuits who were learning in this country, in this process of accommodatio?
Yeah, it definitely it fits. It is a subject that has received more attention from scholarship. It is discipline experts come in to Jesuit history in order to be able to investigate their fields of knowledge. They use them as tools of tools of research, and tools of knowledge. And sometimes, as I often explain to scholars who are visiting the Roman Jesuit Archive, sometimes, whether we like it or not, it's the only information we have about a given subject or people or region from that particular time. That's not to say those people didn't have their stories, but sometimes they were disrupted because of different types of knowledge transmission. But the knowledge transmission that Jesuits employed and then preserved and that we can still access are vital means of world knowledge, and they are part and parcel of the Jesuit Accommodatio project. I would say that without the method of Jesuit Accommodatio, you would not get that body of knowledge. So in some ways, I'm taking a step back to see the framework for it, but I'm also trying to take a step back and not ask a question about world knowledge and its disciplines and Jesuit Accommodatio's contribution to that, which I feel has been noted. I'm really interested to see, as a historian, what kinds of meeting spaces we can find, because we've all been engaged, many of us here in this room, as historians, many of us have been engaged over the last few decades in what is kind of very poorly described as global history, and it's really hard to do. And I'm not claiming to actually have done it right now in this lecture, but what I wanted to suggest was that Jesuit Accommodatio can provide a mosaic piece in what we might call global history, because its nature tended to include all of the interlocutors in the frame, because it was the nature of the method that required those actors to be in the frame. And a lot of other European sources tend to be trying to exclude those voices. And so it's on that note that I wanted to try and approach this particular method and just showcase it a little bit. Yeah, thanks.
I have a gentleman on the left at the back, and then Father Brian here again at the front.
Thank you. Thank you. This was a great lecture. I want to ask you a question that brings us from the global history you were talking about to the European history where I come from. And I have two connected questions. The first is, and you talk a little bit about this in your book, but I wonder if you could expand on it here, whether you see any differences in accommodatio between Jesuits who come from different areas of Europe and have different experiences of accommodating back in Europe to different local traditions. I'm thinking, of course, of the big difference between, let's say, Iberia and Italy, for example. And the second and related question is that, as you know very well, over the last few years, well, decades, the historiography of early modern religious history has valued very much the experience of missions abroad as they reflected back onto Europe. So the notion of Nuestras Indias and so on. And I was wondering whether your strong kind of new take on accommodatio, whether in your mind that contributes, how that contributes to this historiography, and whether it changes the way in which we have to think about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. I think in response to the first question, I do argue, and I have argued actually in various publications, that the distinctive humanistic Renaissance tradition that the Italian Jesuits inherited through their training and their lack of overseas empire did condition in some ways and did shape a particular missionary approach that they tended to associate themselves with very strongly, and that is Jesuit accommodatio. Now, it has to sort of stay anecdotal for me, that argument. I wouldn't know how to quantify it, but it is an argument that I have, that the Italian Jesuits, who I quote from and through whom I came to explore this particular method, because they did tend to be the most visible practitioners of this, most pronounced practitioners of this particular method, has led me to conclude that we need to nuance a little bit the different groups of Jesuits and particular approaches that they might have had. Now, that does not mean that they also didn't have a lot of commonalities. Many of them were trained in different locations around both Italy, Iberians coming to Italy and vice versa, travelling out and being trained in the different colleges of the Iberian Peninsula and even out into Asia. So there are a lot of commonalities. It also comes down to recruitment. The types of Italian Jesuits who were being selected were very high-performing Jesuits. They were a very select group who were specifically chosen to enter into the more elevated social contexts, and to be operating at a very high level of linguistic acquisition and knowledge acquisition in particular fields of knowledge, and to show that. So they were very learned and very selected, carefully selected. Differently from the other, from the Iberians, who instead, as a natural progression of their recruitment processes, sent Jesuits to do all sorts of different tasks, because it was their sphere of operation. So you send a builder, and you send somebody who can wash the clothes, and you can send somebody who can mend the ship, help mend the ship. You know, the Italians were selected in a very different way. So they had a very particular type of missionary approach. And another thing that sets them apart, and again, I'm just speaking kind of anecdotally here, I don't want to push that argument too much. Another thing that sets them apart is that they were chosen exactly to go into the non-imperial settings of the overseas empires in order to not upset local rulers who would look at Jesuits and run the risk of saying, what are you doing sending a Portuguese coloniser into our space? So they would come, and we have these quotes from the letters, as Italians, and say, I'm not Portuguese. I'm a Jesuit missionary, and I come from Italy. So there are many reasons why this is a special group that probably does require a little bit of specific attention without overstating that.
Thanks. Camilla, we have time for one last question, so I'll ask Father Brian for the...
Just to follow on from that, just to look at the academic backgrounds of these young men, if we could look perhaps even more closely at what I'm thinking of with a figure like Matteo Ricci, with his training in maths, his ability in cartography, before they were sent, what processes did they undergo, the young men, before they left Europe, that might help them to engage in this accommodatio?
Yes, well, you know, once again, I think really with the Collegio Romano being in Rome and being the sort of centerpiece of Ignatius's ambition for Jesuit education, it was also a leader right across many different fields of knowledge, including mathematical knowledge and what we would now term scientific knowledge. And it was, you know, way ahead of many other, you know, like institutions. And so it was producing, it was attracting professors and then students who were developing a very, very distinctively high level of knowledge in these sort of scientific and other human knowledge fields, beyond theology and beyond philosophy and the other more traditional disciplines associated with priestly training. And once the news came back from China that this is the type of missionary that we need a missionary with knowledge about the human sciences, then there was a fit. There's a fit that takes place. That's a very interesting moment in time where the needs and the provision of those needs was able to be fulfilled quite successfully when we think about the admiration that the Chinese really did express towards the Jesuit missionaries who were operating there. So they did bring technological expertise that was admired. And that training did often come, you know, at the highest level out of Italy.
Thanks, Camilla. Thanks to all of you here and those of you joining us online for this talk on the Jesuit correspondence from Asia. Thank you, Camilla. One thing that you've helped me to is to complexify my understanding of Jesuit accommodatio quite significantly. In these somewhat accidental spaces of encounter beyond the European colonial sphere, in which Jesuits were clearly a bit more on the back foot, and there was an interesting mixture of agency and receptivity, coercion and freedom. And perhaps most interestingly of all to me has been how that context, that crucible, if you like, of dialogue forced an evolution in the concept of accommodatio, that in self-reflection they had to work out their method of accommodatio in new ways through that experience of encounter with these very different cultures. So a very enriching talk for us all, I'm sure. That's just what I've been taking from it, and I'm sure others have taken many things as well. So thank you again, Professor Russell, for a wonderful talk, and have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Is that correct? Yes. So you're all welcome to come.